As I was listening to Vicki read each of your accomplishments, it struck me that what wasn't in there is the information about how you came to do what you're doing, and what is the sort of the motivation for doing what you're doing. So we'll start.
I actually volunteered to go to an elementary school to talk to the students after some deaths had occurred. And I was a first-year fellow, and they thought it was a model program, so they had the press, and it's Catholic schools, so they had nuns and parents, and they did a big assembly, and from that point on, I just kept getting called. So I just kept doing it.
Serendipity often works, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I always like to play.
No kidding. Everyone who knows you knows that.
Right, and I think, you know, when you watch children, if you care about the human condition and you want to learn about it, there's just no better place to start than asking, how do you jump into the mind of a child and see what the world looks like?
And my start was very different from my ending. I started as a graduate student at Harvard in philosophy, interested in epistemology and ethics. And at that time, which was the late 60s, believe it or not, I was 6 years old at the time, you know, early. No, at that time, Piaget was all the rage. And I started to read about Piaget, and I couldn't believe that that was true, since philosophers always thought children were naive realists or in the same class as imbeciles and other mentally defective individuals. So I went to a preschool to see kids, and I was captured, and I've never left.
Amazing. Yeah. That's amazing, right? That's amazing. So I want to, each of you have been in your field for some time. That doesn't mean you're old, it just means that you've been in your field for some time. And I wanted to ask what you're thinking is about perhaps the most challenging issues that your particular field is facing. I think it's really important for the for our friends here to hear about what are we likely to be looking at in the next 5 to 10 years that are really challenging.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Sure. I went to Nebraska 6 years ago to try to deal with two of the greatest problems that I believe we have in the field, that we have in our society. One is the achievement gap, achievement and opportunity gap, and the other is the early childhood workforce, the well-being of the early childhood workforce. Those are the two most persistent problems that I've ever faced at any time in my work, and that we've made, I think, the least amount of progress on, and so that's what I've dedicated myself to.
So, well, I'm going to follow up at that because we have some time.
Sure.
What is it about those two issues that seem to be almost intractable?
Well, what's intractable is that we have a tremendous tolerance for cognitive dissonance. That we can accept beliefs that are inconsistent with our other beliefs, even though they affect our behaviors. So our major challenge for policymakers is to try to get them to expose that cognitive dissonance. So they say there's nothing more precious to us than our children, but we're going to pay early childhood people less than a poverty wage. That has to stop.
Follow that, Kathy.
I was just going to say, I agree. But I'll give you one other challenge that I work on a lot, is that I think there's a deep divide between what we know from the scientific information about how children learn and behave and what we're actually doing with children. And I want to work really hard to close that gap.
Mm-hmm.
So that again is quite salient, and I think many of us here feel the same. We know so much. Why aren't we doing what we're doing? And so what do you think it is? What's the silver bullet going to be, or bullets, or whatever the metaphor is? Maybe that's not the greatest metaphor. What's the magic? How's that? What's the magic?
Well, in my own world, part of the magic is to do what I call edible science. That's only one small piece. But I think quite often our science is hidden from the people who need it most, because it's obscured in jargon and in papers that really don't make sense. to real people. And so I like to work on making it more accessible, usable, and digestible.
Do you think this should become part of, this is another follow-up, part of how we train educators, healthcare professionals, people who are, researchers who need to make those connections in terms of how to communicate this?
I think it's critically important, and we have just finished or in the process of finishing a 2-year fellowship that's funded by the Jacobs Foundation that we call the Learning Sciences Exchange, and it's to do just that. We invited mid-career scientists, entertainers, policy people, and journalists to work together to solve what has proven to be somewhat of an intractable problem, but one that we're going to solve.
That's great. David?
So I think one of the biggest challenges for kind of the field of looking at the whole child is to try and prove its relevance without minimizing its value. And so I think there's been a tendency to say, well, we need to do these things because it helps promote academic achievement. But then that suggests that that's really all school is about, is academic achievement. And personally, I feel kids will learn. I think they're hardwired to learn. And I think what we have to do, though, is make sure that they have a healthy development, that they reach their full potential, and that they're socially and emotionally well. And we shouldn't be doing that because it advances academic learning.
Yeah, so yeah, sorry, no. So that brings up an interesting point, as we tend to think about the messages or the information that we want to convey to educators, the information that we want to convey to health professionals, the information that we want to convey to policymakers. And it seems like in some way we're sort of our worst enemies in sort of thinking about this in a very siloed way. So I want to ask you, what are the shared messages, what's the shared information that each of you believe educators, healthcare professionals, policymakers, and others really need to understand at a foundational level? Whoever.
Kathy, why don't you?
All right, well.
You go
wanna
first.
jump in? All right.
I'll go.
No, I actually think the most important thing we can convey right now is that outcomes for children are not defined by how a kid does on a test. If we can get that across, we're already halfway there. And I think the best way to convey that is to talk about breadth, a breadth of skills that children need and get as children, with, by the way, the core being founded on human-to-human relationships and the socially gated brain, as Pat and Andy have taught our field. The second is breadth of ages. We no longer live at a time where education and learning is going to be cut into kindergarten, even kindergarten to K-12. It's lifelong, and we have to be prepared for that. And the third is breadth of context, that learning doesn't just happen in school. If children only spend 20% of their waking time in school, the challenge for all of us is what are we doing with the other 80%?
Yeah, that's great. Sam?
You use the word silo, and silos are really our enemy. And the easy way for us to think about silos might be in terms of medicine and education, psychology, social work, and so forth. And those are very significant and serious silos, and they are barriers and obstacles to our work. But one of the areas that I work in very closely has to do with the silos within early care and education. So we have birth to 3, we have preschool, we have primary grades. And if we don't create a hub, someplace in the middle of all that pulls all of that together, we will continue to do this over and over again. And that's when this expression that we stumble on often comes up, and that's fade out. Fade out happens because of silos. Fade out is not a problem of effect, it's a problem of commitment.
You know, the other thing I would say is when I work with early childhood educators in particular, I think they don't recognize the value that they bring to the work that they do with children. So I responded to a community that had massive wildfires, and I remember the head of early education came up to me and she said, "You have to come and give us training today because we have no idea how to help these children." She said, "All we can do is hug them, let them know that we love them, give them a safe and secure environment, give them structure, and let them talk about what's happened, but we have no idea what to do." So I just said, go to the high school and start talking to the teachers there. So I think there's this undervaluing of what we do in early childhood that isn't just from outside. I think they're starting to believe that they don't provide the great value that they do provide every day.
I think, it's what reflected in sometimes the conversation I have with people who are thinking, the most important thing to focus on is learning and, et cetera. And I say, well, if you're ill, if you're not feeling well, if you don't have access to see a healthcare professional, how well are you going to perform in sort of those cognitive domains? And so we tend to have these things separated out when, in fact, the purpose of the Whole Child Award is to recognize those of you who are forward thinkers in integrating us.
May I just add another suggestion to that? I would love to see us throw out the word soft skills and never use it again, because the soft skills are
I'll
hard
applaud
skills.
that.
Or we also call them non-cognitive.
Oh, yes.
And
Let's
that's
dump
less,
that.
less
Let's dump
good
that, too.
than cognitive.
Right. But I think as for those who have attended other think tanks and even in this think tank, that the connection, between what we used to call, because we don't call it anymore, social emotional development and cognitive development, their circuits are shared, they're overlapped. There's essential biology that's driving all of that, and so they don't need to take the backseat to. So social emotional skills don't need to take the backseat to anybody. Right. So tell me what you are planning on doing for the next, I didn't plan on asking this question, but I'm curious. Now that you've done this award, you're not going to retire. Okay, just checking. What are your plans for the next 5 years? What do you want to accomplish that you think can get beyond those challenges that we already are articulated?
Well, I can start. Our center is actually just moving over to Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So
Yeah,
that
I like that. Right, Bob? Exactly.
our goal is to grow the center so that we can have more impact. And it's not just in responding to crisis events, although that is quite time consuming. We want to get education out about how to support kids at times of distress, whether it's through death, whether it's through crisis, and make sure that everyone in a school is prepared to support kids. I always tell the story. I went to the Flight 93 Memorial where the plane was downed on 9/11, and I was doing some training, and somebody came up to me and he said, I'm in charge of groundskeeping. And he said, and I trained every person who cuts the lawn here, and they have a lot of lawn, it's a large national park, that if they see a visitor, they stop what they're doing, they establish eye contact, ask if they can be of assistance, because we're not here for the grass, we're here for the visitor. We should do that with everyone who steps foot on schools, school property, or at early childhood, or in pediatric offices everywhere. So to get that training done is monumental. And so I think that'll take the rest of my career.
Great. It's fantastic. That's exciting.
Well, a lot of what I'm doing is still conducting the basic science and then working very hard to figure out how to translate that into particular projects. And the projects that I'm most excited about right now, and will easily take the next 10 years, one is transforming 2 school systems that we're working on to actually use the evidence-based knowledge to see if we can remake the way people think about education using the breadth of skills approach. The second is we're transforming cities, and we're now in about 10 different cities where we're putting up projects where we transform and really remake architectural design in light of the scientific evidence to encourage more opportunities in a kind of piazza, if you will, for parents and children to interact in the ways that grow cognitive and social skills.
That's fantastic. Quite a challenge.
And we too are just as committed to transformation as my 2 colleagues. When I went to Nebraska, I said that my goal there is to make Nebraska the best place in the nation to be a baby. And that is our goal, and that's a tough one. So that does mean creating more opportunities for all children, reducing gaps in achievement for all children, and making this a fully funded, early care and education system from birth all the way through 3rd grade, so that teachers of young children aren't highly depressed, aren't taking second jobs, aren't earning less than the people who park our cars and groom our dogs. Those are our tasks, and we're not going to stop.
So I think each of you reflect so wonderfully on what the Whole Child Awards in these different areas are about. Like past awardees, you're luminaries in the field, and it seems that you're tireless as well in terms of the goals that you have. So I want to second what Vicki said. It's really challenging to select the winners out of the pools of those who are nominated in each of these categories, and you deserve the accolades that the Sims Mann Institute has bestowed upon you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.